Ngā mihi mahana, kia koutou katoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I feel very privileged to be invited back. Was counting the years actually, and we've all done a lot in between, and it is a real privilege to be here. And I've always been very envious of everybody in Auckland when I see who is speaking at your seminars and the fact that you can listen to people and from all around the world, and so I feel very privileged to be here. I would, however, like to start this evening with a tribute, I think. You talked about Justine many years ago. I'm going to say many years ago. I met somebody who I've seen in the audience here sitting up the back, and her name is Beverly Morris. And I just want to pay a huge tribute to Beverly Morris. In 1975, I became a parent at the Victoria University creche with my first child. It was impossible to continue, there was no early childhood provision for babies in Wellington, apart from the university creche, so I couldn't go back primary teaching. I went back to university and finished a degree in anthropology. And on the advisory committee of the creche was Beverly Morris. Now, I don't think I probably met Beverly in those first couple of years. I began very soon. They needed to fill in, a person to fill in on a Friday afternoon, and nobody else wanted that shift, so I became a worker. We didn't call ourselves teachers. I was very proudly a creche worker at the university creche. Then in 1978, I was appointed as the co-director, coordinating supervisor of the creche, and it was at that stage I really got to talk with Beverly, who came and introduced herself to me, and I learned so much. Now, Beverly, along with a number of other key women, were doing amazing things in early childhood education at the time. Really big things, really hard things, trying to shift the policy, shift the thinking to be inclusive equitably across all services. And that was the environment where I was inducted into the politics of early childhood. And I do have to say it was all down to Beverly. She actually wrote me, I've got references from you, Beverly. I'm not sure whether I got the job or not that I applied for, but I've still got them. They said some quite nice things too. But over the years, Beverly and I, in various ways, have kept in contact. And so we were speaking at Christmas. And so I feel very honoured that you're here, Beverly. And a lot of this is because of you. So the photos I've got up here, the media shot of Prime Minister David Lange, it's a bit grainy to see on the PowerPoint there. It was taken in 1986, and it was my daughter Nell, who's now in her 30s, in the swings at the Lintott Day Nursery at the Hamilton Daycare Centres Trust. Now, this was a political visit at the time that childcare was shifting to the Department of Education. And that shift and the idea that childcare should be embraced within education was something that Beverly and others, and let's mention Geraldine MacDonald, Mari Bell, a whole raft of people had worked tirelessly for years, wondering whether they would ever get through the political system with it. Well, it did eventually happen. Now, there had been promises from a Labour government elected 2 years earlier, but not much had been delivered to support the sector. And it feels very similar or familiar to current times. When an education minister has promised to turn the tide for early childhood education, we are now waiting for delivery. And so it is a little bit similar. So the image seemed very appropriate for the front cover of my book as a metaphor at the time, back in when I wrote it back in 2001, because it was about the swings and roundabouts of the politics of early childhood. You think you're getting there, then you go backwards and you're going round in circles. And it's still relevant. We kept it for the second edition, which was published 2009. And particularly pertinent for the second edition is my daughter became an artist, and at that stage she designed the cover for the second edition. And I'm not quite certain what we're going to do for the third edition, which I want to talk about tonight. Now, there's a side story to this photograph. I had recently completed a master's thesis called On the Politics of Childcare, which had been published as a book, a very small little booklet called Mind That Child. Now, on the preface to that book, I'll just read to you a little bit here. Sonia Davies wrote the preface, and in it she wrote on the front page, "This book recalls the bruising events and fragile gains hard won in the 1960s and 70s, when for most politicians there was considered to be no votes in childcare politics, in childcare policy." And so David Longie's visit to my daughter's centre was, we believe, one of the very first when they're starting to think there might be some votes in this, and he was out on the, out there. But the problem was, and it was partly David Longie's character, he was very reluctant to move away from the camera, the media glare that was all come round, and talk about the desperate politics that we were experiencing. I was the chair of the Daycare Centres Trust at that point, and we were wanting to give him a copy of my book. And we wanted to do it discreetly and everything. We don't want to embarrass the Prime Minister. And in the end, he was playing in the finger paint with the children, so it was all photo ops and everything. And he got his hands dirty, and he said, "Where are the bathrooms?" My husband at the time, and yes, he was a husband, he said, "I'll show you where the bathroom is." So my husband, Crispin Gardner, who was also involved with this trust, trotted along with David Longie, showed him where the bathroom was, gave him a copy of the book, and a very polite ear bashing that, photo opportunities are okay, but you've got to do more than that for delivery. So that was the politics of that book. So, Politics in the Playground was a sequel to Discovery of Early Childhood, which halted its story as preschool education was poised to move on to the political stage of government policy in the 1940s. Discovery also had a second edition, mainly because I'd done a lot more historical research, I could fill a lot of gaps, I could make a lot of corrections, and I wanted to embellish the story with images that I had found. However, the new editions of The Playground are rather different, because what's happened is we've kept the text exactly as it is, but we keep adding another chapter as the swings and roundabouts keep swinging and going roundabout. And I suppose there's also a metaphor. This metaphor of the playground is also a metaphor about the plays of political parties, because part of the metaphor is that they haven't played very nicely. And, going back to I like you, I don't like you has been going on. So, The Playground covers the post-war political story from the time of the government's first blueprint for preschool education, which was radical at the time, that shifted kindergartens from their charitable management, which recognised the fledgling play centre movement, greatly increased funding to kindergartens, and exerted control over their operations. Thereafter, we had the huge expansion in preschool services, but left out of that blueprint were day nurseries, daycare, creches, private kindergartens, preschools. So The Playground is about the swings and roundabouts of political opinion, political demand, advocacy by women. But there's a story too. The Playground is also about creating an early childhood sector and a sense of early childhood advocacy. And it was that broader conception of early childhood which a generation of women that Beverly was involved in was so much part of, and which we inherited. One could also say that part of the politics within this divided early childhood sector at the time, also there was elements at times of not playing nicely. And so you had media beat-ups between kindergarten and play centre, then perhaps preschool versus childcare, private versus community, home-based versus centre-based. We've always been very diverse, and so it's always been quite challenging to bring it all together. But the dynamics of the sector has shifted, and we've learnt that unless there's a reasonable degree of cohesion, you don't move forward. But we've also learned that we need political bravery at the government level to take the risk of shifting us. And that's probably where I want to finish up today, is do we have the political bravery in our cabinet to do this? So the question tonight will be, yes, do we have political bravery? Longy, for all his timidity, was in the end politically brave. He went against a lot of advice. So the two previous editions literally finished when we could not see where it was going. And it's been quite a good place to finish it, and the current edition is going to do similarly. And so in 2000, when I wrote this is the final paragraph of both editions, I wrote that early childhood has always been a site for experiment, but the issue is whose experiment and whose blueprint will guide future policy. A Labour government had just been elected, and we were waiting. Were they going to do anything? And it took another 2 years before we got a strategic plan up and going, another 2 years before it got released, and it's sort of a similar feeling. 2008 was just before the Labour government lost the election, and it was on the cards that National might win it, which they did. And I wrote the very final words, the risk right now is that divergent pathways might emerge. And I would argue that they did. So this was sort of the end of it. And so when I came to the end of this book, which is now 10 days ago, I pressed send, and it's at the publisher. In fact, I pressed send about a month ago, and I can see from the reference group, we suddenly found we were having a meeting of the reference group and the minister was coming. So I pulled back send and said, you've got to wait. There might be something interesting coming from this meeting that I can discreetly put in. But it's now been pressed. And those are my, not the very final sentence, I'll read you that one later. But what we need to look there is, government has offered, you said they would turn the tide. It's not assured though. There is much competition from other groups and education sector groups under review or in negotiation. Much will depend on whether the government's ability to deliver and win a second term in office. So this is sort of, we're sitting there again, and I'm sort of quite pleased in a way to leave it at this point. Now, those of you familiar with politics in the playground might know that the book is sectioned into eras, each with several chapters, but the new editions have added a new era. And these parts are overall themes that shape the political discourse and shape the advocacy. So in the first era, it was about this new blueprint for preschool education, the huge growth and demand for preschool, waiting lists, etc. The second was about the challenge to that blueprint. Demands from a constituency for childcare, the emergence of Kohanga Reo, other models out there. But we're saying, well, our children also need to be part of this. In the third era, we've got government interest in rewriting the blueprint. But the advocacy that had to go on with that for at least 3 decades was huge to actually get that far. So I'm always reminded we have to hang in there for the long term. It also became to be at odds with a new right view of the state. And so the most recent era has been shaped by Labour's 2 strategic plans, sandwiched in between National's so-called agenda for children. So this is where we're sort of the third. That part 4. Now, there are 2 chapters in part 4. Chapter 10 was the new chapter for the second edition. And I've called this new chapter Agendas for Young Children. And it became clear as I started to craft this new chapter for the third edition, I think I started it probably about September last year, maybe, around about there, but I've been thinking about it for a while, that its tone was going to be very different from my chapter called Blue Skies in the Playground. This was the term used by the then Minister of Education, Trevor Mallard, when he launched Politics in the Playground back in 2001. And he thought that the working group for the strategic plan had gone too far by asking for the right of every child to a free early childhood education. And he said it's blue skies thinking. And they were sent back to the drawing board, and they came back with the same statement, but put in brackets, almost free. And that's where it stood. And he didn't give the speech he was going to give it. When he saw the audience in front of him, he lost his courage and didn't give the speech, and gave a very nice speech. But his Claire Wells, who was just being appointed to his office, quietly, as we do, snuck me the speech that he was about to give. And so I've always had a copy of it. But then, Trevor Mallard, in a secret move, under wraps, he went and told his officials, go and cost it. What would it cost to have free early childhood education? And the very first costings of that was totally free for all children under the age of 5. Those costings will exist there somewhere if they could dig them out. It's not what we got. But this sense of shifting policy emphasis was actually first explored when I was reviewing 5 years under Labour and 5 years under National, when I was writing the book on the New Zealand Childcare Association. It was a 10-year sort of catch-up story of what had happened to that organisation. And as I listened to the interviews that I was having at the time, talking with people, I got these are words from people, and they were working in the childcare sector, this sense of excitement during these years as the world started to shift, and then this sense, and the interviews were done 2013, we've had a loss of momentum. And it seemed to me that the 2 chapters in this 4th section were about this loss of momentum, were about the sort of the rise of momentum and the loss of momentum. And so, in some ways, this has been quite a challenging chapter to write, because it's been quite a difficult sort of story. But what has happened, of course, is that in 2017, we had a shift of government and rising expectations again. I think Linda Mitchell really summarised this sense of shifting policy frameworks the best when she wrote, she said, New Zealand policy regimes have highlighted different policy agendas reflecting of the different views of the role of the state. A supportive state which works in collaboration with early childhood communities, and a minimal state where the onus is placed on early childhood communities to step up to their responsibilities. Children are depicted as dependents within their families, and the government intervenes when it regards families as unable to provide it. By contrast, the supportive state approach, children, families and teacher participants are empowered and supported to participate and contribute. And I think that for me sort of sums up what she did so well, those shifting paradigms. Now, a few years ago at the last Early Childhood Convention, I was asked to do something historical, and there'd been a series of books come out which interested me, where people said 100 objects, and I'll tell you the history, and you had 100 objects of world history, 100 objects of German history, some really interesting things where people took the objects and thought, can we frame a history of society around these? So I had to go with 10 objects telling the story of early childhood. And in a sense, this is the approach that I've used as I've written history, through a group of stories. I've never written a sort of a linear history that goes on, that documents it stage by stage, but provided some stories that collectively give an insight into the broader politics of the time. But the hardest thing is deciding which stories to tell. And I have to say that my pen had a whole range, started with far too many, then I clapped some together, and I was still playing around with it right at the end. So this is what I've come out with. It's chosen purely for personal reasons, because of policy writings I've done, presentations I've done during the time, some campaigns I've been involved in, policy development. I've been involved at a little bit of a backdrop at the current strategic plan, had a very distant advisory role in the Te Whāriki work, research I'd done around kindergarten, documents that were dropped in my lap. OECD. Anne Smith gave me some very interesting ones. Play Centre, I got some very interesting ones given me. Gaining access to the Waitangi Tribunal, some documents there. So you go with the data. What do you get? And how can you look at that data and think, what's this mean for me? And of course there were more stories. And probably what I'd like to ask you is, what have I missed? What would you have chosen? The chapter is prefaced by an introductory story on statistics, but there's also some bigger themes too. I think really framing this chapter is the fact that early childhood education was contained by government within a social investment policy agenda targeted towards vulnerable communities, families at risk. And I've finished up doing quite a bit of reading on this, and I'm going to use Treasury's own summary, which summarised it up as investing upfront to support people most at risk of the poor outcomes on later life. This reduces the number of New Zealanders relying on social services and the overall cost to taxpayers. But it was also, the whole policy was predicated on being able to develop large data sets where you can predict who's going to be vulnerable, who's going to need the money. I think the sector has struggled for a strategy in this environment, from protesting it to trying to buy into the approach and playing nicely with government. We can deliver for you. Can we take advantage of this approach? We've had a growth in corporate interest. I have to say I believe we've been poorly served by our Ministry of Education during these years, who's lost a lot of expertise. The commitment to early childhood education in the broader sense has been slight, and a reluctance to address real concerns in the sector. However, whereas in the early 2000s, early childhood had a front row space on the political platform. Every MP knew their early childhood stuff to say it. Now the space, we're getting a space again, but it's crowded. And we've got very bold industrial and political moves from other sectors, and reviews with very bold recommendations and some very bold action attached to them. And so we've got to set what's happening to us. But anyway, let's just have a look at some of what the data says, and I'm not going to read all this. I've used two sets of data, which both of them I think are excellent, and increasingly the early childhood annual census returns have sorted out a lot of quirks in some of the data. But we can see where the enrolments are not increasing greatly. But you can see, if you go back to 2005, we've got quite a big increase in the number of children. You can see the huge increase in the number of children enrolled in education and care centres, decline in kindergarten, play centre, Kohanga Reo, different reasons for each of those. The increase in qualified teachers now is nowhere near what we could have had if the policy had stayed there, but it still did increase, and the huge increase in participation. But I think that probably the more interesting studies are the Growing Up in New Zealand studies. They are rolling out some stunning work. Now we are born, now we are two, now we are four, 2 reports on vulnerability, and I think a recent one has come out, I don't know if it's released yet, we're looking at children in the cohort who have experienced violence in the home. And so just what is this meaning? But if you just look there, what are the high levels of mobility? 1 in 3 children in the cohort are not born in New Zealand. And so this, and if you look at, this is where the data is interesting, even though I don't necessarily like how it's collected, but they use some of the data sets to analyse that 13% of the cohort had the highest level of risk factors, 4+ of the risk factors for vulnerability. And overall, almost 60% had over 2 risk factors, and they were quite, significant risks. So I think it shows, the landscape has changed. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my presentation is quickly go through each of those storylines and just give you a sense of what I told about it. The first story, I think, is captured in these media cuttings. And this is a slide that I presented back in 2012, not long after I collected them, at the London School of Economics. And they were involved in, they had set up a cross-country project on early childhood policy that was later published as a book. And I was privileged to be asked to be part of that, one of the countries in it. And it was an audience of top early childhood policy writers across Europe, where I was positioning, in early days, the shifting paradigm of the New Zealand story. And so while cutbacks was clearly a national government move against early childhood education in the aftermath of a world economic crisis, it wasn't quite as neat as that, actually, because there were hints of it already coming from the Labour government. If you look at the headlines around the 2008 budget, which was the final budget from the Labour government, Michael Cullen is standing there against a red background saying, "We are in the red." And one of the reasons he says we are in the red, and I've got his exact quote, is some of the spending we've done, and he cites early childhood education as being one of the reasons the government is in the red. And so, you know, the tide was already turning there. Let me show you another slide I used in that exact presentation, and I've used it on many other times. I do recycle stuff here. Now, this is what I said to the London audience when I showed this slide. This is what brought 1,000 teachers, parents, including our students in my town, which was Dunedin, out on the street. Now, to an international audience, this is extraordinary, that early childhood teachers would march on the streets, you know, absolutely amazing. The impacts of the cuts on our infrastructure and quality is something we feel deeply about. It's also a recurring political story in the history of early childhood, of investment in early childhood by one party, and either stalling or, in this case, the rolling back by the other party. This is a pattern that does not affect the other sectors of education and has created a very politicised early childhood, but it is very tiring. That was me speaking in 2012. And I think this is very much an exemplar of not playing nicely in the playground at the political level. But as many as you will recall, this was not just a debate over money and saving some, but also about a debate about quality and the costs of qualified staff. The new Minister of Education's view was that the economic reality is that money will be tight for the foreseeable future, so more than ever we must invest in areas that will make the most difference. The qualification debate that we thought we had won back in the early 2000s was being relitigated, as we know, with the cutting of the 80 to 100% funding bands. There was almost total opposition, or there was total opposition from the research committee, whose rebuttals I could add to this slide here. But there was also some not playing very nicely within the early childhood sector. New Zealand kindergarten stood staunch, as did Te Rita Maiaho, or Te Taripuna Ora, as they were called then, but there were some in the early childhood sector who had never supported the need or the cost for early childhood fully qualified staff. And I once had the opportunity to have a few words with John Key when he came down to Dunedin to open a kindergarten for us. And so I thought, well, I'm not losing, Claire Wells was with me, and I thought, well, I'm not losing my opportunity, let's say my words. And so I said my words, you know, because this was about 2013, 12, I can't remember the exact date. And he said, oh, but I understood so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so supported the idea. And I said, no, we did not. But, you know, he had been got at. So here in Auckland, in the heartland of not playing nicely, I have to say, was the Herald's view. Now, I've just given you, I'm not going to read it all, but I've just given you a glimpse of some of the threads of the story of cutting the cost, which included research, professional development. It made for very difficult decisions by centre supervisors and those trying to balance the books. I quote you here from one Auckland manager of a community centre who had done everything right trying to get to 100%, but they were sitting at the 80. And she said, so there was a time when the cuts came and we needed to replace a qualified teacher who left. And I had to talk to my committee and say, I don't want a qualified member of staff. We can't afford someone with a degree in early childhood and 10 years experience anymore if we want to keep the top staffing ratios. We later had to raise the fees too. So everybody was making decisions like this. But clearly the Herald did not think we needed qualified teachers. Now, the new government, as we know, established the Early Childhood Task Force, which produced this report. It didn't bode well. The new agenda was clearly a reference to moving on from the older agenda of the strategic plan. There was no consultation with the sector about the task force establishment, and there was a shift in language towards early childhood as now an investment. The terms of reference, and I'll quote you from them, effectiveness and efficiency of the government's expenditure, cost-effective ways to support children's learning in early childhood, and the task force was asked to develop a new funding model without increasing government expenditure. So, this was, and the report says we all need to step up. Now, there's been a lot written about this task force, and on reflection now, we can say, well, nothing much progressed out of it. Even the good parts languished. Unlike previous policy think tanks that included sector representation, the task force was small, light on early childhood expertise, totally and tightly controlled by government officials. The chair, Michael Mintram, a previous Treasury official and public policy academic, was an advocate for the government's policy directions, and I've quoted him there. I don't intend to read him, but there he is. He had no early childhood background, and that's what he wrote. So what I've done for this, I've told my story from the inside. I've been a great friend of Anne Smith, who passed me her personal papers. And in fact, the week before she died, she passed me a folder of the emails with the chair and various government officials about the fight that she was having on this committee. It was a very difficult time for her. Her appointment was strongly supported by the sector because of her research on children's rights, quality, qualifications, and it did give us some reassurance. But she was the only task force member with any significant longevity in the sector, and she eventually submitted 2 minority reports on qualifications and funding. It got very nasty. Anne herself was accused of not playing nicely, and almost those exact words were used. But we owe her a huge debt because she held the line in very difficult circumstances, making the case about qualifications and universal funding. There were follow-on committees which had potential around quality, infants and toddlers, and you would have been part of that one, I think, and funding. The first 2 reported, but with no action, and the third never did report. So it's a background story I've tried to tell. By 2011, we're starting to see what the new social investment approach actually looks like, and so I wanted to sort of just frame up a story around it. Minister Parata's target, when all 10 challenging results from department heads, she offered 98% of children would be attending as would have attended early childhood as 4-year-olds. She was actually the only minister who got anywhere near reaching her target. She got it up to 97%, and so quite extraordinary. And the process was assisted by surveys, data analysis of designated suburbs, almost street by street, as well as several rural regions. The focus was on community development, supporting cultural identity with the inclusion of all children whose parents want the kind of service offered. Now that was the rhetoric. In practice it was a bit more challenging, but there were some good programs amongst this. But dominating these programs was the broader backdrop concern about vulnerable children who live a life far below the norm and are at significant risk of harm into the future. And so this is what it kept coming back to. You got the green paper, the white paper. The notion of equity funding, I mean, we've never ever believed that every child needs the same amount of funding. It's well embedded in early childhood. But this was different because this was about taking funding from universal funding and targeting it to certain sectors. The Herald started to get more sympathetic, and by 2012, later that year, was saying, yes, the sectors are having cuts by stealth. Thousands of families are going to have to pay more because the budget didn't deliver anything new for early childhood apart from these projects. Again, I've shown this slide on many occasions, but we see what had happened was a new line being drawn, marking the state's role and responsibility in the lives of children and families. And the extremes of these cartoons from the 2002 one, where the Minister of Finance is nurturing the country's baby, it's a country's nanny, to Bill English saying, this infant costs too much, it's not mine, and it's going to eat too much. These are your responsibility, he says to the mother. So this agenda provoked divided views. And interestingly, it was only a month after that particular cartoon, and I think there must have been some pushback from it, that we get this wonderful image of three ministers of welfare, education and health all holding the vulnerable baby at the launch of the white paper. So the state would come in to help, but only in restricted definitions. But since 2017, we have seen a big language shift. The newly named Ministry for Vulnerable Children was very short-lived. Its Māori name is adopted Oranga Tamariki. And here we can see just the language. Jacinda Ardern saying, we're going to have a less targeted approach to welfare would guide social policy that did not conflict with the value of universalism. Bill English was not happy. This was when he is still Minister of Opposition. For no other reason than an ideological dislike for them is disgraceful. Getting rid of them undoes years of work to focus the public service on changing lives and digging into our hardest problems rather than just throwing money at them. So we've got two quite different philosophical views. Now, my story is really trying to show that early childhood education has been caught between these divides. Unlike schooling, it is still not fully regarded as a public service. It's something that governments support, but it's fragile and caught much more in the winds of the political playground. So, this was probably my most challenging section to write. I didn't have it in my original list. I was putting it in the too hard basket until I really started to think about it and thought this just has to be there. It's an unprecedented story in the history of early childhood, and it's still unresolved. Early chapters in the playground outline the beginning of the idea of early childhood education for Māori children in the 1960s, what emerged in the Kohanga Reo in the 1980s, and indeed the development of Te Whāriki as a partnership with the Kohanga Reo Trust. But this is a story of how Kohanga Reo felt buffeted by the swings and roundabouts of early childhood policy over the past 30 years. And from Kohanga Reo's perspective, the Crown had not played nicely at all. In telling this story, I've stuck pretty much to the script of the Waitangi Tribunal, to whom I'm extremely grateful for releasing 60,000 pages to me of all the documents, of which I do not say I have read them all. And I have been very selective in telling this story. In some ways, it's a story for others to tell, but in others, I felt, no, this is part of our history. We must document this story. And for students who might use this textbook, this is a really important story. A hekoi of 400 Kohanga Reo supporters delivered the claim to the Waitangi Tribunal on behalf of the National Trust for, and I quote, an urgent inquiry into the alleged acts and omission of the Crown in relation to Kohanga Reo. Now, what sparked the claim, along with many lingering frustrations and disillusionments with the Crown, principally it was the Ministry of Education and other agencies such as Aero. You know, a lot of disillusionment there, but the immediate sparking, why they were literally got that claim together, was the Early Childhood Education Task Force had a whole section in it about poor quality and declining enrolments in Kohanga Reo. But there had been no formal consultation of any kind between the task force and the trust. And so this was cited as an evidence of the Crown's omissions, an example of what was continually happening. And so the claim was heard over 2 weeks. The report is a really useful report, and any of you working with students, it's a very good one because it's got things very, very well set out, very easy to read, and who said what and what the recommendations are. It's a very good claim, and it can get hard copy. Now, in this story, telling this story, I knew a number of the people presenting the submissions, and so I was interested in what they had to say. So I did tend to frame it around sort of people who I sort of knew. A submission I was particularly interested in was from Anne Mead, who, to her concern actually, she was called by the Crown as a witness, because this is a legal proceedings. And she was asked to outline the history of early childhood policy, which she had been involved in as blueprinting, and where Kohanga Reo had been positioned in that. And again, she was able to show, going right back to before 5, there were recommendations in there about Kohanga Reo which were mainly ignored and never ever enacted. And it just was a repeating thing. So this was the claim. And I'm not going to be here judging the claim. The claim, this is a very tight summary of a very detailed claim. But broadly, it is saying that these issues that had arisen had not only assimilated Kohanga Reo into the mainstream, but cumulatively this had resulted in declining participation, which had contributed to the perilous state of Te Reo Māori. The Trust blamed the Crown for ignoring recommendations and findings of reviews stretching back to the 1988 Government Review of Kohanga Reo that proposed that the tribunal, that Kohanga Reo not be part of the legislative framework of the Ministry of Education, to allow whānau greater control and responsibility of their taonga of Kohanga Reo. So the Crown responded. It firstly did apologise for not directing the Early Childhood Education Task Force to consult with the Trust and promised it would do better next time. And it didn't accept the stark submissions made on behalf of the Trust. The Crown cited examples of partnership, such as the development of Te Whare, because I was really interested in what was being said there, as well as the fact that the Crown had contributed $1 billion to the Kohanga Reo and was annually giving an additional $2 million to the organisation and $85 million to the 10,000 children and their broader whānau. The Ministry described as inaccurate the Trust's views that regulation had led to systematic disadvantage. These responses and the claim are sitting out like that. So, the tribunal concluded there has been no apology. That was asked for, that there be an apology from the Crown. After this, the findings came out, the relationship broke down further. The Minister of Education, Hekia Parata, in a very challenging position there, demanded new governance from the Trust, and the Serious Fraud Office took a case that they won. And so in 2018, with a new government, the Trust has tabled the claim again, and that's where we sit. But at the time the strategic plan draft recommendations came out, and the recommendation was that the Ministry of Education and Kohanga Reo co-design a funding pathway. And so when interviewed, Dame Iratane Te Whiwhirangi responded, the announcement's long overdue. Well, it's about time. I can just imagine her saying this. It was about 6 years ago we were addressing this and no one's noticed. And in the end, that's why we took a claim. Slowly, Kohanga Reo are being dragged away from the embrace of Māori people into a government-regulated system that doesn't work for all of us. So this is an unfolding issue. It's a sensitive story, which I had to give a lot of thought as to how to tell it, but I don't believe it should be set aside from our historical analysis of early childhood education. So we come on to getting something a bit closer to my heart. This is a story, as you know, I've been living and following from both a personal perspective and a political perspective. You can see here all the various drafts of Te Whāriki. And it's quite a long story, but for the purposes of the new edition of the book, I only cover the recent update because I have sort of talked a little bit about it. And I don't get into a description of the update or what I think about the update, but rather try and track down the backstory. How did that update come about? It's a story of survival across shifting agendas. It is one of the things that did survive. Say compared to England, in much fewer years than us, have had 3 very different curriculum frameworks, and we are still working with the same curriculum framework, albeit updated. But it was the introduction of national standards in 2010 that started to put Te Whāriki under threat. A lot of damage was done. We haven't rolled it back yet, with inappropriate programs being introduced into early childhood education, school entry testing creating failure at 5. I've got 2 grandchildren who were told what they couldn't do at 5, or not what they could do. The focus was on the 3 R's, not the early childhood 3 R's, set out in our principles. Now this was so worrying to me, and I have to giggle now a little bit, that in 2012 I can remember I used to teach a course of 3rd year students, a fairly political course on making sure everybody was updated before they went out into the sector, and also contributed to a curriculum course. I remember striding into the classroom one day, I don't know if anybody's here from that class, probably not, and saying, this is extremely worrying. I've just heard Anne Tolley is canning Te Whāriki. And what are we going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? And the students are looking at me in horror, and here you are in your 3rd year about to go out there. And so I set them the task of, okay, if Te Whāriki's canned, and it was certainly feeling as if it might be, how would you go about, what would you put in a curriculum? Now this is an opportunity, so let's not go just into the bad side of it. You might have some advocacy, but you can't just let it go. You've got to get in there and do something. What would you do about it? So they set off in little work groups and all developed their curriculum frameworks. So this was interesting. But there was a lot of conflict between the national government's focus on the vulnerable child as a child at risk and Te Whāriki's empowering child. 2013, Joss Nuttall's, the 2nd edition of the Te Whāriki book, she said, early childhood is no longer seen as a public good, but as a vehicle for risk, minimisation for government now and in the future. The language of Te Whāriki is not one of risk, vulnerability and competition. It speaks ahead instead of opportunity, respect and relationships. However, we have to give due credit to the task force, and it wasn't just Anne there, who endorsed Te Whāriki. Possibly they decided they weren't going to have a fight on their hands, and recommended that it be reviewed though. And the statement was to see if it makes a difference for children. Now, I remember Margaret and I rolling our eyes thinking, well, how do you measure whether it makes a difference for children? But anyway, it wasn't going to be canned. In the event, there was a ministerial change. Heke Parata was the niece of Tamati and Tilly Reedy. We quietly knew that Te Whāriki was in safer hands then. And the Working Party review led by Joss Nuttall was made very clear by Heke Parata that she did not want a recommendation to rewrite Te Whāriki. It was how to go about an update of Te Whāriki. So that's why we've all scrambled for words. Is it an update, a refresh? But it was never a rewrite. Margaret and I decided, well, let's be bold. And so we made a submission to the group let's take Te Whāriki into the junior classes and remove national standards. And there were two junior school associate principals on the group, absolutely in favour of it. And it got as far as Heke Parata that it stayed into the final report. And it was then sent back to the ministry, who sent it off to the schools section to do something about it, and it was forever lost. Every now and then we would ask, what's happened to that recommendation? Never did surface, but I hadn't forgotten it. We're in new political times, new opportunities, abolition of national standards. And initially it was NZEI taking the lead at first, but then the ministry joined in with 6 national hui held around the country last year. And I was asked to speak on Te Whāriki, and I think it was expected I would give a little description of what Te Whāriki was. Well, I'm past giving little descriptions of what Te Whāriki was, so I decided this was my opening slide. Politically, I still think we could win this. The issue would be the ability of teachers in junior classes to implement it. Very few remember the times when junior classes ran playful programs. A large percentage of teachers only know national standards. So this is really a personal record of the politics of Te Whāriki. There have been some shifting agendas, but also some really genuine attempts where we have played nicely and managed to keep on the same page. And the sector support has been crucial to its survival. So my 6th story is one I've spoken of in various forums, and New Zealand has gone off the radar because it didn't happen. And at one stage I crossed it out. Then I thought, no, there's something bigger to this story that is a worry for me, even though it didn't happen here. And also it was a victory for us. It's one of the ones we won. But so I wanted to tell it. Again, I was sort of personally involved, but it was about political secrecy. The lack of consultation with the early childhood sector, both within New Zealand and internationally, concerning the OECD's idea that there would be a preschool version of PISA testing, the baby PISA it became known as. Governments were wanting to know, are they getting value for money? Global rankings are always of interest. And from the start, and I've tracked the start back to 2014, New Zealand was keen to be at the table, was the quote, yet seemed unaware, or maybe was aware, that such testing would undermine Te Whāriki, which at the time the discussion was about reviewing it. And I tell the story in 2 ways, partly through the advocacy here in New Zealand, a lot of it under the wraps, behind the counter kind of thing, and then bursting into the international arena. And it was a story to get our ministry to consult with the sector. They were going to do this without talking to the sector and listen. And also for OECD to make public its intentions. The OECD wasn't putting any documents out, we just knew. So here in New Zealand, I'm part of a research, policy and advisory forum to the Ministry of Education, which only calls us together infrequently, and we have to demand to have meetings. And so, but anyway, this time they did call us together, and it was back in 2015. And we were told of this proposal from OECD. Those of us, and there's only 6 or 7 of us on that committee, that group, we unanimously advised against the idea and continued to do so. We get to 2016 and some of us went public with our concerns because we're all supposed to be very much under wraps, and we do follow very ethical processes in that committee. But it comes to a stage, if we don't do something, it's going to happen. And it's appeared to us that New Zealand was going to sign up. Eventually, in mid-2017, New Zealand withdrew its bid. And there's a public trail on this advocacy that became international. There are people in this room who've been involved in adding to that public trail. But there's also a very interesting internal Ministry of Education trail that Claire Wells requested through the Official Information Act in late 2016 and got 55 pages with many redactions. Now, what appalled me was that the Ministry of Education's records reduced the unanimous opposition from our advisory group to the following statement. A few concerns were raised about Te Whāriki from researchers. So we were wiped out of the official record. So the advocacy then started internally with 3 of our finest scholars on research from that group writing a paper quietly under the wraps for the Ministry of Education discussion. Peter Moss then determined to open the debate internationally. He and Margaret met up in England at one stage and contest the OECD proposal, which he had also heard of. And he pulled together cross-country authors and scholars across key OECD countries to add their name. Now, the names are a little arbitrary. I've got my name there, but I actually barely wrote a word. And Margaret has said to me, look, I can't put my name there because I'm trying to work with a particular person internally in the ministry. So it better be you put your name there. So my name finished up there. So that's why it's there. It's probably got some of the best citations I've got, actually. And so the article was published, the issue was in the public domain, as was Margaret's paper, and a flurry of activism and energy began as named authors and others started to question their own governments. Well, what's going on here? And our own Ministry of Education was very reluctant to allow discussion on the issues at its regular meetings within the early childhood organisations. It was the tenacity of Claire Wells, CEO of NZK, that really had to put the hard word on the ministry so that it could get as to be an agenda item at an ECAC meeting, Early Childhood Advisory Committee of the organisations, and eventually it did. And eventually, OECD also announced its intentions. So the trial is now underway with only 3 countries. But this is not just an OECD issue, and it's one that we won. New Zealand didn't join, despite, from what I can read through the OIA, recommendations from the highest level that we should be part of it. Now, something happened, and I haven't yet found out what it is that we didn't. But you look at World Bank, you look at the International Monetary Fund, all of which are professing a growing interest in early childhood education. Is it effective? Is it a good investment? And they're increasingly concerning themselves about the content of curriculum. And so these things won't go away. They're going to come back again. So in the end, I decided I would put this story there. So, play centre and kindergarten. I can't tell the story of all organisations, and so I picked out 2 because their stories thread through the early chapters in politics and the playground. So I wanted to revisit them in current times in a much changed landscape. And I was very familiar with the kindergarten story, a loss of revenue with the cut to the 100% qualifications, holding on to its values of qualified staff, moving beyond sessional hours. Much debate internally about what is a kindergarten now. Astute political manoeuvring, and pay tribute to someone like Claire Wells here, who was at the political table through very difficult times of the previous government, just determined to keep him there. Considerable collaboration now between early childhood leadership, group of associations and NZK, and also extensive consultation for NZK to become a single national organisation. The vote was not won, but will be revisited. And so I was sort of interested in both of these organisations. I've not been so close to the politics in Play Centre, but there's been a recent very interesting thesis by Suzanne Manning that traces the fate of Play Centre under past policy shifts. And like Kohanga Reo argues it's been hard done by as an organisation. I've also been privy to some documents on their recent amalgamation into a single organisation, which I've used discreetly. But this is a story I focused on primarily because there's another iconic institution, Plunket, has been through the same process. So what is it that's going on? Plunket, kindergarten and Play Centre are having these discussions. And I've been interested because these are organisations that have survived for decades, because they've adapted to new times over decades. It's all about do-it-yourself community organisations. But then they're moving to become more corporate, as corporate entities in early childhood dominate the scene. Now, I think it's too early to see what the outcome is going to be. But I wanted to just position this as a story sort of to watch, and I've just got a couple of quotations here for this. This was the Play Centre Federation, who in 2016 took their roadshow around New Zealand as to why they should have one organisation, saying, well, the association model's not working. Funding model's not working. Well, we all agree the funding model doesn't work for anybody. Play Centre's critical mass is shrinking. The Federation, Association and Centres are at tipping point. We believe that if we fail to act now, it will not be there for our grandchildren. Very stark message. Sue Stover, sitting in the audience here, counters that message, 2018, in an editorial. And I'll leave you to read that. We could put up very similar debates in kindergarten about the issues of joining into a national organisation or not. And so I think it's something that is happening and we just aren't quite certain where it's going. So my very final and just last brief comments are on turning the tide or not. This is another story still unfolding, and the outcome will not be known before it comes to print, which they're saying will be at the end of the year. But this announcement about a new strategic plan for the sector in new political times was in the main hugely welcomed by the sector, we were delighted, which had experienced such cutbacks the previous decade, although there have been some sectors which have profited greatly in an unregulated environment. The sector had been absolutely underwhelmed, though, after this plan was the draft, that there would be a strategic plan, when in the first budget last year we got 1.6% after 9 years of getting nothing. It was not a good look. But this is what the Minister was practising, and this came out in the first 100 days of action of our new government. And yeah, wow. Turning to the principle of free public education for early childhood. You know, this was something. However, my next slide perhaps says it all. Is it going to turn the tide, or will it be a trickle? And I found this wonderful image of Chris Hipkins with a trickle coming out of the kettle. The strategic tide was certainly needed to stem not only for recapturing past wrongs, I suppose, but to stem this tide of scandals about failing centres, mistreatment of children, stressed teachers, very unsafe environments, rapacious fees. ERO reviews and evaluations were indicative that there was a level of poor quality in failing centres. And as a member of the Research and Policy Advisory Group, I was fortunate to be on that, as a member of the reference group. We were kept very much at arm's length, I have to say, but we did get a chance to say plenty. And at its first meeting, the Minister came, and I asked him the question, how bold could we be, seeing he told us to turn the tide? And did he really mean that he intended to turn the tide towards public early childhood education, which had been undermined by both political parties, not just national? The Minister said he welcomed bold proposals. And so Linda Mitchell and I subsequently developed a bold briefing paper called Turning the Tide, with proposals for some models of public early childhood education. Seems to disappear. A timely release of doctoral studies by Anne Pearman on architecture and large group sizes, and Mike Bedford on air, heating and noise level, captured media headlines. But we can also see caution in the Minister's reply. Yes, be bold, but just remember, we do have to shift the experiences, but you can't turn everything around overnight and say there's a whole set of new rules. But you can put a time frame in place. Now, we've always been concerned about time frames. So, I think this is my last, it's the second to last slide here. So across the spectrum of strategic plan recommendations, we have to ask, how bold were the recommendations? I certainly think they're in the right direction. Many are long overdue. Some, however, such as the return to 100% qualified teachers, seem to me more timid than the 2002 recommendations, which said the date, this is when we're going to have them, and set out a schedule, which we almost reached. So instead of using both a carrot and a stick, as the 2002 plan did, the current plan is only using a carrot, with the term we're going to incentivise people. But compared to the conversations in the school sector and the polytechnic, where there's been very bold recommendations, which are causing a furore, we mightn't all agree with them, were tabled, one can ask, were we bold enough or were we a bit timid? Were we trying to play too nicely and not cause too much upset? I think there's disappointment for me that the draft is not sufficiently brave to turn the tide, with incentives to establish community services, disincentives to corporate investors, incentives to deliver pay parity to teachers, the word is not even used, and or to forge ahead on the design and regulation for better environments, and or we're still waiting for preschool children to have the right to an early childhood education. The Minister, in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, I don't want to say too much in detail about that meeting, but what he said was there is a broader conversation that we've got to be part of, and that is the broader conversation with the schools and with the tertiary sector. And it won't be till later in the year that he puts everything together and knits it all together, and then we might find a little space for early childhood. But he didn't actually say that at all, so that's not to be quoted. But that, but we've got to wait for the broader, we are part of a broader conversation. This isn't just about early childhood education. So I wrote my final words. Major moves forward in the sector have always required political courage to offset cries within the sector, resistant to quality requirements and accountability, and always from Treasury and political opponents seeking more minimal state involvement. But against the odds, it has been done, with contentious changes gradually becoming the new norm. Just as Beverly and her colleagues asked that childcare become part of education, which was ridiculed, hugely contentious, it became the new norm. And so we've still got to be brave. I did ask the Minister a couple of weeks ago, how bold could he be in Cabinet? Did he need some help there? And he assured us he was bold. He could be bold, but there are a lot of spending priorities on the table. And so that's where it is, that's what the book is, and I'm just pleased it's off my plate for now. Thanks a lot, everybody.